It's getting closer.
Keep running.
I yanked the burned folder out of a collapsing shelf, and it left a grey smear on my thumb, "Do not open," printed in block letters across the tab. Guilt pushed my hands to hold the folder away from the other paperwork, guilt that arrived before any explanation. The shelf smelled of motor oil and lemon cleaner. My name is Alex Mercer, and I was stocking filters and light bulbs when the folder forced the problem into the open. I had come back from the laundry room with a box of spare towels under my arm and found Evelyn at the desk counting receipts. Evelyn folded the receipts and kept her eyes on me. "None, what did you find, Alex?" Evelyn. I set the box down and tapped the folder. "This," I pushed it toward her. The paper was brittle at the edges and the stamp had singe marks. Evelyn's hands tightened around a pen. Her voice flattened. "Don't touch that. That's been sealed for years, and doubt arrived then, cold and practical. Why seal a file in a motel that lived or died on ratings and clean rooms?" Doubt made me lift the tab anyway. The folder contained a dated work order, pencil scrawl that listed a room number, and terse notes about a patch in the drywall. The penciled room number matched the motel door I had passed every night on rounds. Room 14. Then my chest tightened. Guilt and doubt bent together in a decision. I shoved the folder back and said, "We should open it. We need to know what's behind that wall before renovation." Evelyn's mouth thinned. She moved to the window and peered at the cracked parking lot. "Not on my watch," she said. "You don't know how this would look, Alex. People talk," and she used the motel's name like a shield. She used the name of the motel instead of answering the question. Her reaction did two things at once. It tried to bury a risk, and it admitted a risk existed. That double move made my anger flare into something sharper. "Then, Evelyn, the renovation crew is scheduled. We can leave a wall patched like that and call it safe," I said. My voice had a clipped edge, and I rubbed my temple the way I always do when I am trying to steady the sentence. And Evelyn folded her hands and said, "Alex, trust me. We've sealed that room for a reason." I heard the syllables of her sentence more than I heard the meaning. I heard the motel's ledger creak under the weight of something decided long before I worked here. The folder made a small, concrete problem out of an old policy. It forced the motel's history into present tense. We argued in short lines. Evelyn insisted reputation. I insisted safety. The exchange was direct and quick. At one point she said, "You don't need to open old wounds," and I said, "Neither do tenants. They need a room that isn't half drywalled." Her eyes slid to the clock. The sun had not yet set, but the hallway lights hummed low. She relented with a compromise that sounded like control. Supervised entry, small crew, daylight inspection, no press. Her voice had an edge that said she expected me to keep my head down. And that agreement pulled me from doubt into a brittle resolve. I agreed because my hands shook when I imagined letting a structural problem go unsolved. The feeling moved me to action, not reflection. And by the time we walked down to the corridor, the motel felt like furniture with breath. The carpet under my shoes released an old cigarette smell. Fluorescent lights hummed above the door numbers. Room 14's door was a warped slab of veneer with a brass number half screwed on. The lock looked like it had been forced once and then given up. Then the crew for the entry was small. Me, Evelyn, and a renovation worker named Julio who smelled of plaster and diesel. Evelyn kept her name badge clipped to her blouse and rotated the metal keyring in her palm. Julio carried a pry bar and a small flashlight taped to his head. And now we pushed the pry bar into the warped lock and worked the door open in one slow, mechanical motion. The door offered with a long creak, then stuck on swollen edge. I put my shoulder into it and felt the catch give. The threshold smelled of dust and old hotel soap. And inside the room, the bedspread was folded tight. A single motel chair sat by the window. A neat patch of drywall on the far wall looked like someone had tried to cover an odd, circular section. The dust lay in thin layers over the chair legs. Small things showed a long pause. The bedside clock stopped at 2:42, the toothpaste cap folded like a thumbprint. And Giulio flashed his light across the wall near the patched panel. Looks like they cut into it once. Whoever did this put it back up sloppy. Giulio. His words wanted a practical fix. And Nevlin stepped in and said, "We leave the panel alone until I decide otherwise." Her voice tried to be businesslike, and it kept skittering off to fear. And I moved closer to the patched drywall and felt a low vibration under my fingertips. The hair rose on my forearm. The vibration organized itself into rhythm. 3 slow impacts, then 2 quick ones, then a pause. And knocking. The sound came from inside the wall. It was steady and deliberate, the kind of rhythm you could count. The knocks had texture, wood on wood, the scrape of something hard against plaster. And Nevlin's face changed. She called my name, quick and sharp. "Alex, step back." And my first reaction was to step forward. Curiosity and guilt braided into a demand to know what had been sealed away. Curiosity moved me forward. Evelyn's fear tried to pull me back. That tug was an emotion shift from resolve to hesitation. And I put my palm on the drywall. The knocks answered as though the wall had been listening all along. My fingers felt dull thumps passing through sheetrock. I heard a faint metallic tang in the air, like a penny left too long in a rain puddle. Giulio refused to stand near the wall. He kept his back to the door and spoke in short lines. "This is freaky, Alex. We should board it up and leave." Nevlin barked orders. "Everyone out." Now, her voice folded authority and panic. She moved to the door and held it open like a lifeline. 2 of our small crew stepped back into the corridor and paused there, looking at each other for permission to run. I hesitated. My chest hurt and my palms were slick. Guilt pulled at me, guilt that I had put the motel into renovation without reading the old paperwork. Doubt crawled up my neck. What if the folder had more than notes? I forced my jaw and said, "Stay with me." "Giulio, get a camera." Evelyn locked the corridor, and Nevlin's hands trembled when she pulled the security door shut. She punched a code into the monitor and jogged back to the bank of screens in the office. The security monitor hummed into life with 4 small windows, one of them pointed at room 14. The feed glitched before we could see much. Frames dropped into smeared bands. The image unfurled into static, and then a single warped frame. An angle from inside the wall, a smear like a face pressed against plaster. The smear had no features, only a suggestion of depth where a cheek might be. Nevlin slammed a palm against the console. "That isn't good, Alex." "That is not good." An accusation sharpened her voice. She looked at me as if the decision to open the room was my staging. "Are you messing with me?" She said. "Did you plant something?" "I didn't plant anything," I said. My answer was short. I felt suddenly exposed and small. The monitor's corrupted frames told me there was something that did not want to be seen. That knowledge changed the problem. It turned a physical repair into a confrontation. And Nevlin's suspicion moved the room into politics. She worried about guests, insurance, and rumor. My frustration with her protection impulse changed into anger. The argument that followed had quick lines and clipped edges. "Evelyn, we're not covering this up," I said. "Alex, you don't get this." "You don't run this place." "I do," she shot back. Giulio muttered, "This is our problem now, whether we like it or not." His voice had a grit that wanted to leave. The monitor stuttered again, and the knocks began in a new pattern, faster, closer, as if whatever lived behind the drywall was moving along the studs. The sound filled the corridor. The lights seemed to wobble with the impacts. My breath hitched. Fear moved through me, sharp and immediate. I shoved my shoulder against the patched panel. The knocks slowed, and then went into a cascade that felt like a command. Something behind the plaster scraped, and then forced a wet, tearing sound. My arms tightened on the pry bar because I could feel the structure give. This was the beat we had warned against. Then Giulio yelled, "Alex, knock it off." He lunged for the bar and struck the panel with the butt of his hand. The drywall buckled under a wet, thick pressure and a small hole opened like a mouth. For an instant we saw dark, textured space behind the plaster that had the sheen of cold flesh and old nails. And Nevlin screamed and shoved us back. "Get out! Get out now!" Her voice split. She pushed past me down the corridor. The crew scattered, shoes clacking on linoleum. I stepped forward though my knees trembled. The hole made everything immediate. The air inside the gap smelled of metal and a chemical tang that made the back of my throat swell. The knocks came again, hard and organized. They answered each movement. Then something struck the inside of the drywall in a pattern that matched a heartbeat. The wall flexed and a thin strand of material slithered out and hit the floor. It had the color of old plaster stained with something the size of rust. Giulio shouted and kicked at it with his boot. The strand retreated. Then Nevlin grabbed my sleeve. "Alex, we are leaving." Now her grip was a physical order. I could see she wanted to protect the motel's name, and in the same move, the thing inside the wall. That contradiction made me distrust her more. This was the twist. Her protectiveness was not only about customers, it was about history. We clattered into the parking lot in a scramble. The injured worker walked with a limp and blood on a shirt cuff. Evelyn the men to call it an accident, and to lie about the cause if they had to. She spoke in business sentences, and fear tightened the corners of each. I followed her inside. She closed the office door and sat heavily behind the desk. Her hands were folded, trembling. "We cover this and we keep it off the books," she said. "No police. No health inspector. People will talk, but they'll forget if we clean it up and refurbish." Her practical plan collapsed into moral pressure. She expected me to accept hiding the truth. My chest burned with shame and something hard to name. I felt guilt coil into a choice. Either follow her and pretend nothing happened, or press for disclosure and risk everything. This was the second emotional shift. From anger to a moral fracture. "Nen Evelyn," I said. "You sealed that room. You put that patch up. Did you know what was in there?" The question dropped like a stone. She went silent so long I could hear the fluorescent hum. Then she said, "You weren't here when it happened. I have kept this motel running for 30 years, Alex. I have done things you can imagine to keep this place open." Her voice broke once. Then Giulio's presence loomed at the doorway. "Talk is cheap, Evelyn. Someone almost got hurt." Nevlin's answer was a short line, "Not on my watch." Not again, she avoided saying again, but the word hung between us, a concrete accusation that some earlier incident had existed. The revelation changed my understanding. Evelyn had been involved long before I arrived. That twist made the folder make sense. The folder was not a random archive. It was an accusation from the motel's past. I pressed for facts and she gave me thin ones. A tenant who left a mess, a contractor who refused the job, a night that ended with a call to the county for repair. She refused to describe the cause. Each refusal reoriented the blame back onto me. I left the office because I could not stand the claustrophobic air. I carried the folder with me, not because Evelyn, but because my fingers kept returning to the burned tab. The folder felt heavy with intention. I went out to the back of the motel and sat in my car with the engine off. I took the single piece of broken drywall Giulio had given me, small, dusty, with an edge ragged and wet, and turned it in my hands. I recorded the log because recording was what I could do alone. My hands rubbed my temple the way they always did, and my voice came out in clipped lines. I said the facts, named the actors, and left out speculation. I held the folder on my lap and the drywall on the passenger seat. My mouth tasted of disinfectant and copper. Guilt was the emotion that opened the decision, and it stayed with me in the recording. Doubt had led to action. Fear had forced the retreat. By the time I finished, my sentences were short and sometimes broken. I spoke the names often, Evelyn, Giulio, so the record would show who had made which choices. And then the final line of the recording was not a promise. It was a command to myself: seal the file, hide the part of history that would ruin the motel, or tell someone and watch the walls tear open again. I set the recorder to stop and the tape clicked dead, and I left the engine off and slid my hand across the folder's singed edge one last time. Then, because I could not reconcile Evelyn's need to protect the motel with what I had seen, I wrote a single instruction on a blank index inside the folder. Do not open. I did not know whether I meant the door or the paperwork. The index ink smeared where my thumb pressed it. And then behind the motel, the night did not change. A single car passed on the highway and the sound swallowed into the desert. In the office window, a monitor glitched briefly and a smear of light crawled across the screen. I thumbed the recorder's stop button. The tape sat like a thing that could be replayed and used. I put the folder back on the passenger seat and wrestled the lock closed on the glove compartment. And when I looked up, the patched drywall in room 14 still sat behind the door, closed and ordered like a book on a shelf. The knocking had stopped. The silence that replaced it felt like a held breath. I started the car and did not drive until my hands loosened on the steering wheel. The chapter ends with me turning the ignition and driving away with the folder and the small scrap of drywall a few inches from my knee. Concrete objects that refused to let the incident be a rumor. I pulled the recorder out once more and whispered. Evelyn saw it. Julio saw it. The wall bled sound. I closed the folder, felt the scorched edge, and drove toward a dark road that would not answer me back. And I did not sleep that night. Every time my fingers twitched, I expected the knocks to start again somewhere in the car. The motor's neon sign made a steady, tired buzz behind my eyes. The last thing I did before I turned the recorder off was press my thumb to the burned tab and promise only one thing. If room 14 opened again, I would not pretend I had not heard it. The hand on the wheel stiffened, and I drove until the parking lot disappeared behind the rise. They forced the warped door, and the wall answered with a single, deliberate knock. Guilt tightened my throat and pushed my hands under my jacket, where the burned folder was starting to edge toward my ribs. The contractor cursed, the pry bar slipped, and Evelyn, "Hold it, everyone." I heard the word, hold, as a command and as an attempt at control. The knock came again, slow and precise, and the crew froze with the bar half sunk in rotted wood. I tell you that to start where it mattered. I had the burned folder in my jacket because of a moment from the back storeroom. Because I had yanked it off the shelf and a grey smear stayed across my thumb. That happened in the closet behind the front desk, among cans of lemon cleaner and a wonky shelf that always leaned. I did not tell Evelyn about taking it before we started the renovation because guilt made me small and secretive, not brave. That guilt shaped every move I made that night. Evelyn crossed her arms and scanned faces. "Alex, what the hell did you do?" she said. She my name like a question and a charge. I rubbed my thumb against my jacket without meaning to. My cheap flashlight thumped against my hip. The tape on the handle left a sticky strip under my palm. The maintenance foreman, Mark Reyes, put his hand on the bar and tried the door again. Mark's voice was low. "We either pry and go or we leave it sealed. We do this now or we done do it at all." He spoke like a contractor who'd seen a dozen rotted doors and counted them as simple obstacles. The crew shifted their weight, boots on linoleum that had no right to be as worn as it was. The pry bar caught. The door gave with a dry, splintering sound, and the smell hit us, burned paper and something oil, saw that wasn't motor oil alone. The smell rolled out first, then a single, measured knock came from inside the wall opposite the bed. It wasn't hollow wood knocking. It was timed and heavy enough that everyone counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, pause, 1, 2, pause. An early shift happened the instant the knock matched no human rhythm in the corridor. Doubt inched across faces. I felt my certainty, whatever I had been holding on to that night, begin to slide. The knock's slowness made people listen like hunters, not just witnesses. We left tools piled in the hall and backed away. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "That's a contractor's nightmare," she said, and I could hear her thinking of Yelp reviews and insurance claims. "Seal it back tonight. We'll decide in the morning." Her voice tried to hold business up like a barricade, but it trembled at the edges. We did not seal it. Mark, we could leave an exposed hinge at 2 in the morning and drag sleepy guests into a scene. He wanted to finish, and the contractor's head nodded at his side. Evelyn argued, then capitulated. She tucked her keys into her palm like a shield. We moved to the small security office to watch the monitors while the crew took a break. On the wall of screens, room 14's feed flickered in a stable grey square before the knock made it lurch. The frame skipped, then smeared. A static line crawled through the bed frame and bent the edge of the mattress around an invisible seam. Mark pointed. "You seeing this?" he asked. Evelyn leaned in, fingers folding tight. "Turn the light on again," she instructed, but her eyes were fixed on the monitors. She called me by name. "Alex, pull up the other feeds. Look for interference." Even when she sounded like she was running hotel logistics, her voice was searching for something to anchor to. I clicked through cameras, toggling angles with the cheap mouse. The feed for 14 broke into horizontal bars as if someone dragged a magnet across it. When the knock echoed in the office, the bars synchronized with the sound. One thump, a smear, pause. Then a flash of warped gray that for a second made shapes in the mattress, like faces trying to push through cloth. None of us spoke for a moment long enough to be called silence. Our breath filled the room instead. Doubt shifted into concern. Concern shifted into fear. Those were the emotional changes that followed the knock. People made small movements to keep control. Mark lifted a flashlight and checked cable connections. Evelyn tried to call a maintenance contact. I kept my hand over the folder without meaning to. My fingers rubbed the burned tab under my jacket like it was the only real thing left. "Evelyn, we close tonight. Alex, we tell guests the water is off." She it as a plan, and then as a plea to the hotel ledger god. Mark protested. "We already started. If we go home now, we risk that wall collapsing. We risk someone getting hit. We can fix the seam and be done." He used repair words to keep the world technically solvable. She looked at him and then at me. Her voice narrowed. "Alex, stay with us. Watch the cameras." Dante be wandering into the room, the name again, practical and sharp. The crew moved back along the carpeted corridor toward room 14, because they needed the money and the overtime. I watched them go with the folder burning a faint heat through my jacket. At the bed wall, Reyes pried off the baseboard with a crowbar and found a seam in the plaster, thin, patched over with older plaster and fresh scuff marks at its edge. The knocks accelerated from the wall once the seam was exposed. Metal taste rose in my mouth. My stomach rolled as nausea crept at the back. Mark saw and stepped back. He kept his flashlight steady despite the shake in his wrist. "Alex, don't touch it," I said, and I heard my own voice break because of how much I wanted to pull the crew away. My hands wanted to move in 2 directions at once, to cover the seam and to reach for the folder. I did neither. I stayed close to the monitor bank because Evelyn had told me to stay there and because staying felt less like to lying. Mark put his shoulder to the wall where the seam met. The knock shifted pattern when the flashlight's beam found the scuffed area. They began to match the strobe of the light, 1 pulse with the beam, 2 when he held steady, then a discordant extra beat that sounded wet against the plaster. The CTV responded in visible ways. Frames bent, pixels smudged into grey teeth. "Jesus, Mark," and the word left his mouth as both exclamation and warning. The crew backed away. One of the younger guys, Omar, said, "We shouldn't be doing this." "I want out," he spoke plainly. The tension snapped into a decision point for the group. Go or stay. Evelyn tried to bargain. We shut it. We don't put anything online. We sign a maintenance hold. We call a board inspector in the morning. She used administrative phrases because she knew how to shape a lie into a procedure people trust. Mark scoffed. That's not a fix, Evelyn. Something S in that wall. It reacts. He used the word react like something a mechanic might say about a faulty machine. When Mark tapped the seam with the handle of his screwdriver, the knocks changed into a sharp, bracing rhythm that vibrated through the screwdriver into his bones. He dropped the tool and staggered back, clutching his forearm. He stayed upright and breathed. He didn't fall. That choice mattered. An external event. One of the crew was hurt, or thought to be, and that forced the group into motion. Evelyn shouted, "Get back! Get back!" As if distance would unmake whatever was happening. She folded her hands into a fist and bit down on the inside of her cheek. She looked older all at once. Alex, close the feeds. Record everything. Mark, take Omar to the clinic. Now, her sentences were short, executive. She relied on me to do the emotional labor she refused. I hit record on the Duva feed and the drive light hummed. The monitor froze for a second, then came back with static lines. A box of the screen flashed a frame that showed the plaster seam like a bruise on the wall, and behind it, a dark oval that did not belong, a hole, or an absence. My stomach folded around the folder again. When Mark leaned forward to lift a loose piece of drywall, a hand, slick with something that smelled metallic, pushed outward through a hairline crack and shoved at his forearm. His breath left him in a sucked gasp. "Get off!" he yelled. The crew scrambled. Omar grabbed Mark's jacket and pulled him back. Mark's face went drained. "It slapped my arm," he said. He touched the spot like it might be warmth from a heating coil. The hand left a smear across his skin that smelled of copper. That copper smell stayed with me in the office monitor like a visual stain. The knocks changed into a furious, ratcheting force then, so fast the plaster buckled. A portion of drywall split and splintered outward. Something slick and rubbery pushed through the opening with a wet, sucking sound. It was not a hand and it was not an animal. It found the air like a thing testing density. It wrapped along the inside edge like wet putty and then moved with a deliberateness that made Mark scream. I ran. I done to mean I walked briskly. I mean I lunged into the corridor toward the splintered wall because people needed help and because guilt made me act. The crew was already pulling Mark away. The thing inside the wall retracted as if noting the movement and then slammed forward with a thickness that made a crewman's wrench fly out of his hand. The noise was impact and suction both. Mark's jacket was shredded at the sleeve where the thing had brushed him. He vomited and coughed. It grabbed me. He kept saying it grabbed me. He kept repeating it like a fact he could T-fold into explanation. Omar kept his hands on Mark's shoulders saying, "Mark, breathe. Mark, breathe," that back and forth dialogue rooted the scene in physical attempts to stabilize. Evelyn pushed through the crowd, eyes wide. "We close it now. We close it now. We seal it," her sentence looped. She moved from managerial argument into physical orders with no stop. "Bring anything heavy. Bring concrete. Get the truck." She spoke authoritatively, but her hands trembled. Mark argued despite the shock. "You can just bury it. Evelyn, you can hide it. People will get hurt. You have to call someone." He sounded like someone whose prior faith in procedure had cracked. He looked at me. "Alex, you saw it on the feed. This is not just drywall," his voice demanded an alley. Evelyn shot back quickly, the manager resorting to the same old ledger argument. "If I call the police and this spreads, it ruins lives. It ruins the motel. We have guests to think of, we have bills. We don't need a panic." Her words were a defense and a confession of priorities. That argument forced a moral split in the crew, a council formed by necessity. Mark wanted to call authorities. Omar wanted to leave. The contractor wanted to finish for pay. Evelyn wanted to seal and manage reputational damage. I stood between them with the folder heavy under my jacket and the drive blinking under my palm like a heartbeat. The thing in the wall knocked in time with the flashes on the CTV like a percussion instrument reacting to focus. Every time someone leaned close, it slotted into a rhythm that matched their breath. When Mark raised his flashlight, the knocks altered to match the light pulses. I realized then that attention changed it. That realization shifted my approach from fear to calculation. The thing reacted to observers. It reacts to us, I said. My voice was low. I tried to be precise because the fact itself was something to plan around. It matches our lights and screens. Point them away and maybe it calms. Mark looked at me with an expression that combined exhaustion and hope. Evelyn's mouth tightened, then Dante give it anything to match. No phones, no cameras. Come on, her sentences clipped into orders again. She moved like someone balancing two boxes, one labeled safety and the other labeled motel reputation, trying to decide which to drop. We attempted containment. The crew pushed furniture against the door and covered the splintered drywall with plywood sheets. Mark insisted we pry open a larger access point to make sure nothing else moved inside. He wanted to inspect, and that desire to inspect would drive the rest of the night. Evelyn argued for a temporary seal and a morning inspection by inspectors she trusted. The argument got louder, 3 to 6 rapid exchanges between them where both names were used and positions hardened. Mark, open it wider. I need to see what it does. Evelyn, no. We seal it now or we lose the motel. Mark, if you seal it, you bury proof and it comes back later. Evelyn, if you open it, you invite whatever that is to finish something. A knock interrupted them, precise and loud enough to rattle the loose screws in the plywood. The group flinched. That interruption forced a new external event. The wall breached again, harder this time. A ring of nails sheared out and a section of drywall tore away. The force made a crewman throw his hands up. Something slick and bulbous shoved through the tier and pressed against an exposed stud. It pulsed slowly, then a small corner of it pushed through like a fingertip trying a latch. Mark grabbed a crowbar and hacked at the material. The thing recoiled and then slammed back. It made a sound I can only describe without metaphor. A wet drum hit, followed by a hollow rasp. Omar yelled, "Mark, get back!" He pulled at Mark's arm. Mark was close enough to put his face to the opening and see texture, rubberized, pigmented with a glistening that smelled like metal. He tried to catch it with his gloved hand, and it slid, leaving a smear of copper scent. The climax arrived exactly where our beats predicted. The knocks crescendoed into violent impacts, and the wall splintered outward. The thing pushed, grabbed, and when a section came free, a slick mass rolled toward the opening, and then reached. It found a forearm and curled like a hand closing. Mark's shout broke into a roaring sound as he was pulled toward the hole. Omar and 2 others hauled him back, ripping him out of the grip long enough to tear the jacket and Nick's skin. We scrambled. Wrenches clattered. Feet slid on linoleum. A lamp was toppled by accident, and the bulb shattered like a white blink. Evelyn barked, "Back! Back!" She shoved a metal cart in front of the doorway and then grabbed a plywood sheet. People moved with the speed that comes from fear in short, precise bursts. Mark lay on the floor panting, hand wrapped in a towel that was already stained. He touched the place where the thing had gripped him and flexed his fingers like a man learning motion again. He didn't cry, he didn't curse. He kept saying, "It tried to pull me in. It tried to pull me in." The repetition showed both trauma and a mind trying to file the fact. Evelyn's face had a new line cut across it by the light. Her hands were steady when she spoke, which was odd because earlier she had trembled. "This ends tonight. We barricade, we make it impossible to reopen. We say that repairs are done at dawn and we don't tell anyone else. We'll pay a fine. We'll take it on the books. That's safer than a scandal." Her words were a plan and a silencing. Mark sat up slowly. "If you cover it, people will still feel it. It moves through walls. It will find a seam. It moves to attention." He looked tired and furious. "You don't get to decide what gets buried, Evelyn. What if a guest gets hurt?" The argument became about responsibility in real terms. Faces around the corridor hardened. Evelyn answered in clipped sentences that showed who's used to choosing. "If we call the police, They'll bring more eyes. They'll bring reporters. They'll close us down for months. I will lose everything." She spoke as if the motel was a living ledger that required her constant tending. She looked at the crew. "Do any of you want to be the one who lost your job because of what we do tonight?" Her question held leverage. There was silence long enough for us to hear the building's aft kick and hum. We exchanged looks. The final decisions were not just tactical. They were moral. Mark wanted transparency and inspection. Evelyn wanted control. The crew wanted safety and a paycheck. My guilt nudged me toward confession and exposure. My fear kept the burned folder warm and secret. I made a choice that changed everything. I slipped the folder out from under my jacket and set it on the monitor desk. I pushed the Devar drive across the plastic laminate toward Evelyn and the contractor at the same time. "If we're recovering this, then everyone signs a statement. If we done I'm taking this out. I'm taking the folder and the footage with me." My voice was even, which is what happens when you decide to finish a loop you've been running around. Evelyn's hand went to the folder before she could think it through. Her fingers splayed on the tab, and she saw the burned edges. She took a breath like she was smelling lemon cleaner and mothballs together. "Alex, give me that. You don't know what that does if you take it out. You don't know who you call and what follows." She used protective language, then changed to a threat. "Don't make this worse." Mark stood and helped Omar secure a sheet over the splintered hole, while the contractor called for plywood and concrete. The decision was made in motion. Evelyn arranged for 2 crewmen to stay overnight and for the rest to leave. She arranged to have a temporary closure sign printed. A plan to contain rather than resolve took shape and held because it was simple. I did not leave. I sat in my truck in the motel parking lot while the crew drove away with the plywood tied to a trailer and the contractor muttering about liability. I drove to a diner and sat under fluorescent lights and pulled the folder out again. The tab still smelled like smoke. I lay the corrupted 680V clip on my phone and replayed the frames that the Devar had copied to a portable drive I had tucked into my jacket pocket. Pixels smeared and a shape pressed at the corner of the mattress like a thumb. Back at the motel, the final external event unfolded. Evelyn arranged the barricade, paid 2 men to watch the door, and filed a terse maintenance hold. She signed a paper that read temporary hold, structural repairs, and left a voicemail for a building inspector with an edited version of events. She cleaned marks from the hallway with lemon cleaner and made a note in the ledger about an electrical fault. That was her cover. I watched her from the car, headlamp catching the name badge on her blouse, Evelyn, and the chip of gold on her finger. I did the one thing I had been avoiding because guilt made me protective of my secret. I uploaded the footage and a photo of the folder to an anonymous archive and sent a time-stamped copy to an investigative reporter I'd found once, months before, who had shown an inclination toward obscure corruption. I left a copy with a lawyer friend who handled workplace cases. I texted Mark from an unlisted number. "Get medical help for the arm. Keep the receipts." He texted back a curt, 3-word reply. Already at her, that reply was both a relief and a new spike of fear. 3 days later, an inspector arrived under a formal complaint from an anonymous tip. He walked the lobby with a clipboard and asked short questions into his phone. He wore a plain jacket and did not look for drama. He climbed the hall to room 14 with 2 officers because the report noted a structural hazard. Evelyn met them at the door and handed him the typed maintenance hold. Her hands did shake when she did it. I watched from the back seat of my car across the street while the inspector and the officers opened the plywood. They opened it slow, professional, like surgeons revealing a wound. The inside of the wall, once exposed, showed fresh nails and a patch that had been made fast and heavy. The inspector thumped the plaster with a gloved knuckle. The knocks returned for a moment, soft, deliberate, and then the officers looked at him as if to say, "You feel that?" He frowned and tapped his radio. He called in a structural crew and a hazardous response team to examine possible chemical contamination. They photographed the seam, catalogued the scrape marks, and bagged a sample of the smear on Mark S. sleeve that had been removed in the air. Evelyn watched them work and then stepped back. She turned toward the ledger, signed a document the inspector provided that acknowledged a temporary condemnation, and then walked to her car without looking at me. She had one conversation with an officer in which she used the words safety and guessed a lot. Later that night she resigned. She the desk clerk, she was leaving town for a week to visit family. She took her name badge off and dropped it in the glove compartment like a coin. Mark was discharged from the hospital with bandages and a strong warning to rest. He texted me a picture of his arm with a small circular bruise, and the towel stain faded. They put me on disability for now, he wrote. Get a good lawyer, Alex. Don't take this on alone. His texts felt like both orders and a plea. I called and left a message asking him to come by the office. He did, and when he arrived he walked like a man who had been pulled through something, and then soon back together. The lawyer I had given a copy to called me in the morning. She spoke in calm, professional sentences. You did the right thing keeping records, Alex. Evidence matters. But be careful, people will ask why you hid the folder. People will ask why you didn't call sooner. Be honest. We'll help you draft a statement. Her clarity was a relief, and my guilt thinned by degrees when faced with someone who could turn confession into procedure. Evelyn's resignation hit like a corporate closure. The motel was closed for structural inspection and then condemned for repairs. News reports hit the cable that week and showed the monitors with warped frames. Some versions leaned toward sensational headlines. Other pieces called it a structural hazard and moved on. The anonymous archive post I made showed the burned folder and the corrupted clip. The reporter's piece that ran used a version of the footage and a careful editorial distance. The folder's burned edges were reproduced in the news cycle, and a small online community traced a dozen similar incidents and posted their own recordings. 2 weeks after the sealing and the condemnation, I sat in front of a microphone in a rented storage unit where I recorded a voice log meant for no one if necessary and everyone if inevitable. I put my voice low and steady, the way I had learned to speak when forced to tell something uncomfortable. I described what we had done, what Mark had suffered, and how Evelyn had chosen opacity over disclosure until external pressure made the choice for her. I described the folder. The burned tab, the K, type-printed label "Do not open room 14" that had been blacked at the edge. And the way the paper had left a grey stain on my thumb when I yanked it from the shelf. That recording, plus the drive and the photos, went to the same lawyer and to a small group of investigators who agreed to look into the archived reports of similar events. The motel's condemnation held through an administrative hearing in which an expert confirmed contamination and structural anomalies consistent with sustained impacts from inside. The ledger of the motel was audited. Evelyn's bank records showed payments to a contractor who specialized in unadvertised repairs to difficult rooms. The audit found a pattern of silent closures and off-books repairs stretching back years. The discovery changed public attention from a single oddity to a pattern that demanded explanation. Evelyn was questioned. In the interview, she recited the ledger defense, concern for guests, risk to the business, but the records and the patched seam made the explanation creak. She broke at one point and said, "I didn't want to ruin things for the people who work here. This place is what keeps us going." She it in clipped sentences that did not absolve but did explain motive. She accepted an administrative fine and a requirement to inform future buyers of latent hazards. She did not go to jail. Mark accepted a settlement and the hospital bills were covered. The motel remained closed and a chain of liability suits began. For me, the arc felt like a release and a wound. The guilt eased because I had not buried the folder, and because records existed outside my chest. Guilt shifted into a sort of exhausted relief and then into a steady watchfulness. I stopped sleeping in the motel parking lot. I started to fix my jacket's flashlight properly instead of wrapping tape around the handle. I told the lawyer everything I remembered in small, factual sentences until my confession was a timeline. That timeline became a public record. There was one twist I had not expected. When authorities reopened the room under controlled conditions, they found another sealed cavity in the adjoining wall with a different texture of plaster patched over and kept tight with industrial adhesive. Inside, tucked behind a concealing plate, they found an old motel ledger page with names crossed out. The names linked to long-ago guests who had never checked out in the usual way. The ledger had notes in a hand that matched Evelyn's mother's signature on older hotel deeds. The discovery suggested a connection across years, decisions, and a family duty to hide certain facts. That revelation changed how the public read Evelyn's choices. It spoke of an inherited burden rather than a lone managerial lie. The evidence made clear that room 14 had been sealed before, and that rooms adjacent had borne the cost. It reframed the folder not as an isolated warning, but as one piece in a record of containment. The twist shifted the story for me from a simple management failure to a multi-generational pattern of concealment. That revelation forced me to work with investigators to map the motel's repair ledger and old ownership documents. In the end, the motel's condemnation became permanent. The county purchased the lot and removed the building. They poured concrete into the doorframe of room 14 after excavating and cataloging every fragment they could find. I stood at a distance the morning they poured and watched the concrete flow around the threshold. Men in hard hats talked quietly. They nailed metal plates over gaps and tested for radio interference. The cruise foreman tapped the newly laid concrete in 3 places, and the sound carried and faded. When the concrete truck finished pouring and the final line of metal was bolted, there came a quiet, a measured, distant knock that came once and matched no living rhythm. It echoed across the empty parking lot and then stopped. Men looked at each other. The inspector wrote in his notebook. Mark touched his scar and said, "That's it for now." He try to turn that into anything more than a fact. Evelyn watched from the police cruiser as her name went into official files. She didn't look triumphant or defeated. She looked like someone whose choices had finally been placed on paper. I kept the burned folder. I did not donate it to the archive. I told the lawyer I would keep one copy and leave another where the investigators insisted. I keep the burned tab wrapped in plastic tucked in a safe deposit that the lawyer helps me maintain. I kept a copy of the corrupted footage on a drive that I encrypted and sent to multiple custodians. The evidence existed now in places beyond me and Evelyn. My last act that night was small and concrete. I sat in my truck with the engine off and set the folder on the passenger seat. I placed my hand over it and felt the edge of the burn where the paper had curled. The guilt I carried had softened into a different sensation. Responsibility. I had been the person who took the folder and then did something with it. The choice to reveal changed my life in technical ways, lawyers, hearings, interviews, but the moral weight eased because I had turned one secret into records. The motel lot is fenced now. There is a small placard that reads, "Property condemned due to structural contamination. Do not enter." People in the nearby highway diners still talk about the warped site TV frames and the knocked rhythm. Some tell the story like a rumor, others like a cautionary tale. For my part, I go to work in a different place that smells less of lemon cleaner and oil. I sleep in a small apartment whose window looks out at a street lamp. I keep the cheap flashlight with tape on the handle in a drawer. On the 2nd anniversary of the sealing, a neighbor from down the block called me and said she heard knocking under her floorboards at midnight for 3 nights, and that the inspector came and said there was no structural reason to explain it. I told her to document it and call the investigator who had stayed on the file. I told her to keep a log. I told her the things we learned. Pay attention, record, done, assume silence is safety. The conversation was short and functional. That is how I have learned to respond. The book of events closed in administrative terms. The people involved found variations of closure. Mark got his arm working again and found work in construction management. Evelyn moved away and kept quiet. The motel slot sits empty and the county map marks it down. For me, the folder remains a cold object with a burned edge and a blacked tab. It is proof of a choice and of consequences. It is the thing I keep when the memory tilts toward forgetting. The last sentence of this chapter is an action that binds up the last small conflict. I locked the folder in the safety deposit box, slid the key into an envelope, and handed it to the lawyer with instructions that if anything similar happened again, she was to give the key to the proper authorities immediately. That was my choice and my registration. I had taken the folder and I had not buried it. I had made records, informed others, and put the evidence where it could no longer be swallowed by a brittle ledger or a fearful manager. The motel's door was filled with concrete. The ledger pages were catalogued. Evelyn's resignation stood as a formal consequence. The physical threat had been isolated and physically blocked. The human consequences were addressed. I walked away with the folder locked behind a bank vault and the knowledge that I had done my part to move guilt into action. Outside, an inspector tapped the concrete one last time and made a note. The sound of the tap answered with nothing. In that silence, I turned my back and drove away.